When Dylan moved to Lakeview, he was too young to remember where they'd lived prior. Not that it was anything special, a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, New York. The suburbs were a welcome change to the rest of the family. Diane and Ron were his parents, a stay-at-home mom and a police officer. The money was okay, enough to support the family with a few extra things here and there. Lakeview was a small town in upstate New York with a tight-knit community. Everyone knew everything. Surprisingly, not many people knew about the tower in the woods, the place where people really didn't go. It was located off a dimly lit river road that ran parallel to a foul-smelling wetland. Every time someone drove down the road, they'd immediately smell the musty, dirty aroma that wafted through the woods. Needless to say, people who avoided the road and never even thought about the woods. There was another street on the other side of the forest that went the same way. River Road was almost useless, beside the fact that it ran straight into Dylan's house. Kids are a different story. When Dylan turned 9, the woods were his stomping grounds. Building forts, naming paths, climbing trees, skipping rocks through the swampy water. The smell didn't bother him. It gave him comfort. It was just the smell of the woods to him. He made a few friends in school, although he wasn't the least bit popular. Their names were Allison and Carter. Dylan would have them over after school to do homework and talk about a band that they would start and be the most famous people in the world had ever seen. A few weeks into 5th grade, Dylan decided he would show his friends to the woods. He had kept the place all to himself before, but as he grew closer to his friends, he decided to reveal his safe haven to them. One day while sitting in Dylan's room, he said, "Alright guys, you know the woods up the road." Allison and Carter looked quite confused, nodding their heads. "Those woods no one goes in. I've had the place all to myself for a while, but I really want to show you guys the cool stuff in there." At this point, Dylan was very anxious to go out and show them the place he had only known all this time. Allison and Carter looked at him for a moment before Allison said, "Those woods smell funny. You go in there?" Dylan smiled deflated and he scowled and he started putting on his shoes. His friends followed suit. He announced to his mother that they were going into the woods. She gave them a smile from the living room, on the phone, and mouthed, "Be careful," before the door closed behind them. They trekked down to the opening of the woods where the smell hit like a brick wall. Dylan inhaled deeply and let out a satisfied exhale. He motioned to his friends to follow and they started on the familiar path he made. They came up to the fort that he had constructed a few months ago. Dylan added a few sticks before proclaiming, "This is my castle." Allison and Carter looked wide-eyed at the crooked structure of sticks, and Carter was the first one in. From inside he yelled, "Cool man, you brought out videotapes?" Dylan's proud smile faded when he saw Carter exit the fort with a VHS tape in hand. Carter questioned, "Why'd you bring this tape out here? You can't even watch it or anything." Dylan looked at the tape confused and scratched his head and said, "I didn't bring that out here. Someone else must have found my fort." With this realization, Dylan was very disappointed. There were a few moments of silence before it was broken by the excited voice of Allison. "Maybe they built a fort that they would want us to find, like a treasure hunt." Carter nodded his head quickly in agreement and Dylan's smile began to return. Dylan replied, "Yeah, there's this one area across the swamp that I've never gone to because I can't cross." They agreed that their mission was to find a way across the water to meet this other wanderer of the woods. They walked up and down in the front of the water and furiously brainstormed. "Maybe we can build a bridge," Carter suggested. Dylan replied, No, it would never work. It's too far across." Allison was about to add an idea when they heard a loud crack. They turned to the source of the voice and saw a broken root jutting out of the ground, snapped in half. It was almost pointing to an area of the water that split into a series of creeks. They walked over to it and could suddenly make out a pre-existing structure. It looked like a very thin bridge that zigzagged its way across the creeks. An audible gasp of excitement emanated from Dylan as he happily started on the 4-inch bridge that lay across the putrid, muddy waters. The bridge was broken in a few places, which would cause for jumping some creeks and maneuvering through thick thorn bushes. After a solid 20 minutes, they made it across. In front of them stood a large stone tower, surrounded by a flat, concrete clearing covered in leaves. The area was circular and surrounded by creeks, almost like the moat of a castle. Sounds of excitement came to the group as they all jogged towards the structure. They came to the door and opened it right up without hesitation. Inside was a spiral staircase leading up. There were light bulbs coming out of the walls all the way up the stairs. Dylan flipped a switch to the right of the front door to no avail. Regardless, they climbed to the top of the tower where the staircase opened into a makeshift kitchen. Right in front of them were a few cabinets, a microwave, and a very large sink. Next to the sink were tools that looked like they belonged in a dentist's office and a few empty bottles of bleach. Confused, they explored the kitchen, opening up cabinets and turning on the faucet. Dylan looked at the running water and he asked his friends, "How do you think they got running water all the way up here?" His friends looked at him and they shrugged, and they continued their inspection. They came across a heavy steel door clad in padlocks and deadbolts, all of which were unlocked. The group agreed that the door felt almost hidden and that it added to the sense of adventure. More excited than ever before, Allison pushed the door open. Inside were tall bookshelves full of VHS tapes and plain white slips with names and dates on them. They were ordered alphabetically, and Dylan looked across some. Alex, 92, one read, and Andrew, 99, was written on another. There was a tape missing before a tape labeled Brian, 95. Their excitement turned to confusion as they continued their search. A small television sat in the corner with a dirty old notebook on top of it. Allison crossed to it and flipped through the pages. She finally spoke. "It's just a whole bunch of names." She turned the book around to show her friends. Carter walked over to her and happily wrote his name below the rest, and he giggled, satisfied. They continued their search when Dylan came across a box full of old camera equipment and he shared it with his friends. Looking just as confused as everyone else, Carter looked at the VHS he had been carrying since he had left Dylan's fort. The white slip was blank, and he pulled the tape out. Written in a black marker was Brandon, 01. Carter's face turned beet red and he turned it to Allison. She covered her mouth, gasped, and whispered, "Brandon." Dylan was looking quite confused when he asked, "Who's that?" Carter cut him off. "My brother went missing in 2001. He never came home from school. They found his..." Carter got choked up, then he cleared his throat. Silence fell over the room. Carter broke from his daze and walked to the television set. He turned it on and he inserted the tape. No one protested. They knew they couldn't stop him from watching it. Allison and Dylan worriedly looked at each other, not knowing what to expect. The tape started up, and it displayed a room with gray walls and an empty bed covered in white sheets with a brown stuffed bear in the center. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, entered with a backpack on. Climbing on the bed, and he held the bear. You could hear him say, "So I did leave you in the fort, Grizzy." The boy smiled to himself and looked around. The kids watched the video, confused as ever. The boy looked into the camera and was visibly confused when a loud slam came through the speaker as the boy was startled. Quick thumps like someone was running were heard and a large man appeared on the screen. The boy looked horrified and his knuckles were white from squeezing the bear. The man stood over the boy, breathing heavily, and he caressed the side of his face. The man climbed onto the bed and Dylan, Carter, and Allison all turned away, afraid they'd witnessed a man hurt the boy. They ran out of the room and came across another door. It was painted white, although the paint was chipped and peeling. Still scared and confused, Carter opened the door. They stood frozen as they saw a camera lying on the floor in a bed covered in white sheets with huge, copper-colored stains on it. In the corner of the room, the same bear from the video was lying on the floor. Carter began to cry and they ran out down the stairs into the clearing. They saw the road on the other side of the woods visibly through the tree line. They ran towards it as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. Roots and branches seemed to reach for them as they ran away. Allison jumped over a small creek and made her way up the hill through the trees to safety. Dylan followed and stopped to wait for Carter, who had been hysterical since they ran out of the tower and had been moving slower. Carter jumped up when Dylan saw a root reach out and wrap around Carter's foot. He fell and he whimpered. Dylan reached out and grabbed his friend's hand and looked into his eyes, full of terror and running with tears. Dylan swore he saw Carter dragged away into the foliage. He tried to run and help him when he heard a loud scream come from the tower through the speakers of the television. Almost too scared to function, Dylan ran up to the hill and met his friend there, both crying and screaming for help until an elderly woman found them. The police investigation didn't take long. They went out into the woods and they saw the tower. Apparently it was part of a sewage treatment plant that used to be down there. Abandoned in the mid-80s, the woods always had a putrid smell. When the police found the tapes and reviewed the footage, the children in the tapes were all identified as missing children from around the country. They never found Carter. They searched the woods and found the bodies of all the children in the tapes, lying at the bottom of the swamp. No one ever questioned the putrid smell of the swamp. They all just avoided it. All of the bodies of the children had been laying there, some for over 20 years. All the bodies but Brandon. His body had been found years ago in a dumpster, in the next town over only 3 days after being reported missing. They never searched the woods. Dylan swore to the police that he saw the earth drag his friend away. The police told his parents that a child's mind will do anything to recover from a trauma like the one that Dylan endured. The man in the tapes was identified as a man named Kenneth Brown, who was found hanging in his apartment 3 years ago. His room was full of stuffed animals. Ever since I can remember, my uncle's root cellar terrified me. A nameless fear. They told me it was just a child's fear of the dark, and I believed them. My family would push me towards the door in the back of the first room. I would kick, I would scream, I would cry, I would bite and scratch. Anything to be free of that dark unknown. And looking back, that was smart of me. But I would not be telling you this now if I had been smart. No, if I had been smart, I would have let it go. But my relatives would tease me. I kept struggling against them each time we would visit my uncle, out in the middle of nowhere. Miles outside of the smallest town you can imagine, in the middle of rolling pastures and thick woods. The cellar itself was set in the side of a large hill, the door facing the pasture below. A large pond always covered in a thick green algae. An innocuous round-top door that leads into the earth and stone room, set into a rounded mound near the middle of the hill. A room full of barrels and dust. That's what I saw in the first room, from my safe perch outside, clutching the side of the hill. For years, I would fight anybody trying to get me within even 5 steps of that door in the back. No one believed me when I told them that something was on the other side. Something inexplicable, intangible. Just the wild imagination of a child, they would say. And I believed them. Because when I turned 12, I was suddenly a big boy and no longer afraid of those childish things like the dark and scary cellars. So to prove everybody wrong, I came up with the best idea I had ever had. I would go into the root cellar the next chance I got. But I thought, no one is going to believe me. So I brought my camera and the biggest flashlight I could find, the kind with those giant black batteries. Well, I hid these in the back of my mom's car, and the next time we visited her sister and brother-in-law, I ran off to steal myself. I'm a big boy. I'm not afraid. That's what I told myself repeatedly, as if trying to convince myself it were true. Once I was sure I had enough courage, I crept through the almost always propped open entrance. So far so good. I'm alive. There's nothing. That familiar sense of dread, it washed over me. But big boys aren't afraid of the dark, or monsters. So I turned the flashlight on, making lightsaber sounds as I swung it around. A bit cheesy perhaps, but it gave a 12-year-old the courage to keep walking. As I came to the back door, I swallowed a large lump in my throat and I approached. The door looked similar to the first, but darker. Not only the darker the room, but the door itself. I convinced myself that the door just hadn't seen that much sun, so it hadn't become sun-faded. Or maybe it had been made out of a different kind of wood. It didn't look so scary with the large flashlight shining on it. I would need both hands, so I set it down, facing the door. Camera in the pocket of my shirt. I put both palms on the door and I shoved. The door weighed a ton. It took all that I had to push it open. Part of me felt that maybe it was so heavy because I wasn't meant to open it. But that was silly. Big boys aren't afraid of anything. I kept pushing until my small body would be able to slip through. I jumped back and I grabbed the flashlight, pointing it at the opening. I swore then, and I still swear now, that as I pushed the door open, I heard a loud breath, as if it came from the maw of some colossal creature. They would later tell me it was just the air rushing out. It was stale, musty, and old. This room had not seen light in maybe a century, longer perhaps. Timidly, I crept inside, the flashlight the first thing in, waving it around. This was the point in the movie the monster leapt out to eat you. That not happening, I poked my head in. The room was empty. In fact, there was nothing inside. Not even a spiderweb. Not a living creature at all. Not even the evidence that anything alive had set foot in the room. Not for the longest of times. This seemed strange. The previous room was filled with dusty barrels, a few wooden boxes, a myriad of cobwebs, and the husks of dead bugs. Mouse droppings littered the room. But yet this room, nothing. The door creaked and I leapt, screaming, bobbling around with the flashlight as I dropped it. I caught it, heart almost stopping. If I broke that, I'd be alone. Alone in the dark, in the back of a spooky root cellar. Alone. That thought itself was a relief. I chuckled and looked around, the entire room made of earth, packed as tightly as you can imagine, lined with limestone. I didn't know that at the time, but I have since looked it up. Bits of what I assumed to be iron were in the blocks. It looked natural. Maybe they chose it to be pretty. That's what I thought. I did like the rocks. The ones I found in the backyard with shiny bits of iron in them were my favorite. The large flecks of iron cast the beam of my flashlight around like a disco ball. Why had I ever fought so hard to not get into this room? It's not so bad, I thought to myself. Well, I proved I was a big boy. Only one thing left to do. Evidence. I set the flashlight down, shining at the ceiling, if that's what you call it when you're underground. Bits of light cast around by the large cluster of the metallic flags, but still not enough light. I turned on the flash and made sure it was charged. I could hear it whine as the capacitor charged the flash bulb. Once the light came on, indicating the full charge, I held the camera at arm's length. I stuck my tongue out and gave myself bunny ears, ever the Joker. The flash went off, blinding me. I had to rub at my eyes when it was gone. Purple spots all over my field of vision. The flashlight no longer seemed as bright as it should be, but it was flickering. This worried me. It was a brand new battery, I was sure of that. I grabbed it and I started to leave, tucking the camera into my left pants pocket. I slid through the door when I heard that heavy breathing again. Only this time, a raspy whisper. "Thank you." At this point, I freaked out. I was alone. My sisters were playing off in the front yard. My mother was chatting with her sister and her husband. I turned to the door as it slammed shut in my face. I ran, screaming into the house. I grabbed my mother around the middle, red-faced screaming about the monster. But no one believed me. It was just the wind, they told me. But how could the wind shut a 50-pound door from the inside? From the inside of a room that is not exposed to the wind. No less a door that an average-sized 12-year-old boy had to struggle to push open. No one believed me. It's just your imagination, they said again. I did not sleep that night at my grandmother's house. She already had a large collection, hundreds of dolls. I had a slight phobia of them, ever since seeing Child's Play at the age of 5. But tonight was different. I was hearing things. Dark shadows crept along the walls. I had my flashlight with me, but it just kept flickering. Every time I heard a noise or saw something out of the corner of my eye, I couldn't use it to shine in that direction. By the time it would stabilize, there was nothing there. By the time the sun came up, I was barely upright. I wanted to sleep, but I just couldn't let myself sleep. But as would happen to any kid, I eventually nodded off. Nightmares are the only thing that I remember. Well, at least waking up from one. Being shaken by my mother and screaming my head off. I nearly struck her with the flashlight. But no matter. That was how it began. Every night for as long as I could remember, I couldn't let myself sleep. I heard and saw things that no one believed. A few years later, I could no longer manage it. Living on an hour of sleep a night was taking its toll. I had put on so much weight by then. I nodded off one night around midnight. I woke up to my mother in the room, holding a butcher knife, just staring at me, blank face and blank eyes. When I jerked back into the headboard, she looked up, a strange grin on her face. "Dinner will be ready in just a few minutes, dear." She then turned and walked out of the door. I clutched the blankets up to my chin, not even daring to blink. How could I go so slack? How could I let myself doze off? So long did I spend pondering this. I didn't notice the shadows creeping around. Not at first. By the time I did, there were other things occupying my time. I heard a muffled scream and I ran into the hall. Mom was in the room that my sister shared. Blood was everywhere. My younger sister never stood a chance. She was run through asleep. My baby sister felt the movement and woke up. She let out the scream as she was stabbed in the ribcage. I got there just as the light had left her eyes before my mother turned to me. "Oh dear, you weren't supposed to see this." "Wow, I'll just have to take care of that." Before I could act, she drew the butcher knife across her throat and fell over. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow. It seemed to scurry along the walls, but I ran over, checking on things. No pulses on my sisters. They were gone. Though I was genuinely terrified of my mother right now, I checked her wrist and she had a weak pulse. I ran for the phone to call the police. Being in the middle of nowhere, they took 15 minutes to arrive. And by the time they did, no one else was alive. I kept my wild story to myself, and I let them figure it out. No one would believe me anyways. I didn't need to be locked up in some loony bin, foster care. That was my future. Or past as it is now. Bouncing around from family to family. Strange things would happen. They didn't like that I would try to stay awake all night. And if I fell asleep, something bad was going to happen again. It wasn't until I was 17 that it happened again. I fell asleep. I woke up to my foster family dead, throat slit. Not again. That's what I screamed. I liked this family. They were nice. They didn't treat me the way others did. Like some lunatic who ranted and raved about the shadows on the wall, the noises in the night. The police were called again, and I knew that they suspected me. I was the only survivor twice, but there was no evidence that could put the knife in my hand. There was no blood on me. Blood splattered everywhere in the carnage, and I had not a drop on me. No more foster families. I just got a job working at some dinky fast food joint. I can't even remember the name. It was a knockoff of one of the big chains. In such a small town, people would eat there even if it wasn't a big chain store. The drone of working the register kept me awake until I went home. Then I would sit and stare at the television, even if nothing good was on, even if it was static. That might have been a mistake because in the snow, I lost the ability to stay awake, and I dozed off. I woke to the shadows again, things falling over, shattering glass, shrieks of anger. I was onto the game by now. I lived alone, as far from people as I could. For years, I had bested whatever it was that followed me around. But, like the idiot I was back then, I let it know that. I told it, "That's right, I'm winning." It didn't like that. Not one bit. The next time I fell asleep, it got me. I woke up this time on my feet, soaked in blood. And this time, I had a knife in my hand. A family lay at my feet. Police with their guns trained on me, shouting, "We told you to drop the knife and get to your knees." I had no idea what they meant, but I did as they said. I dropped the knife and I got on my knees. 5 fully grown men tackled me. And of course at this point, the only thing I could proffer in my defense was that the shadows had possessed me. Great idea. But that was my story and I stuck to it. They declared me mentally unfit, unbalanced, and they tossed me in a padded room. Found not guilty by reason of mental defect, but still locked away in a mental hospital. But they had let me out. I was quite sane. Sleep deprived, but sane. But still, the whispers in the night, shadows following me around. It wasn't long before I was locked up again. I tried to drive my car into a bridge, or rather, I succeeded. But I forgot to take my seatbelt off, and I was carted back to the padded room for observation until they moved me into one of the rooms. Not getting out this time, but still the whispers, the shadows. Oh, how the shadows follow me. And now I sound like the raving psychotic they hold me out to be. But I swear to you, this is the truth. Would an insane person admit to sounding completely and totally insane? Don't answer that. I can feel it, even now. It's coming again. It's mad. 19 years and it hasn't gotten what it wanted. It hasn't taken my sanity yet, or my life. But as I write this, even now, I feel my strength to continue fighting, sapping away. If they knew I was out of my room typing this, they would not be happy. But you have to know. You have to know my story. You have to know what to do once I'm gone. Please, just take my words at face value. When it comes for me, oh God, I can hear it now. I don't have long. When it comes, when it kills me, please, bury the remains in my uncle's root cellar. The enclosed attachment will have the address. I dare not put it in this. I don't want people to know where it is. Place where my remains, hopefully with this monster, this demon, whatever it is, inside them and into this room. Shut the door and lock it. Barricade it if you have to. Hell, blast the damn entrance to the mound shut. No one must ever disturb this thing again. I have to finish this. I can hear it. Hear it at the door. The lock trying to turn. The tinkle of glass. This is my last desperate plea. Hear me. Spread the story. Tell the people. Even the ones who thought I was crazy. A psychotic mess. I was sane. I tried to fight it. But I let it out. And it's all my fault. I am sorry to all the people that got hurt. The door is opening. I have to hit send. Out of time. Out of time.
My father told me a story once. I'll never forget it, for a few reasons. I think it's the first story he ever told me, as a child. It's also the story of how my grandfather died. But honestly, that isn't the reason. You hear stories on TV, or sometimes you overhear something in a public place. People talk about ghosts and aliens, and you think to yourself, this ain't real. They're making it up, or they're mistaken, or they're crazy, or something like that. You just can't believe it. Until something happens. Something that brings it all together, connects the dots in a way you didn't think of before. Maybe it happens to you. Maybe you hear the same story again and again, happening to different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a lot bigger than you thought it was. As I said, this is a story my father told me, but I never believed it, even though he swore up and down that it was true. It wasn't until I started clicking around the internet I started to believe. I started to hear other stories, just like the one my father told me. It didn't take me long to believe in the rake. That's not what my father called it, of course. He never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know what the consensus has taken to naming it. When he chose to call it something other than it, or that thing, he called it the Skinwalker, after an old Cherokee tale his grandfather told him. But I'll tell you the story, the way he told it to me. We were out hunting one night, he'd tell me. Coyotes. We'd kill them for $50 a skin. They lived on a dairy farm in Ohio. They'd kill calves sometimes. We'd do it every night because we needed the money. Sometimes, while we were out, we'd come on a deer and kill it. Our landlord didn't mind, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home. Walking. 'Cause we didn't have a car or some four-wheeler back then. We'd cut through the woods. That's when we came up on it. Blood everywhere, splattered on the trees, in the grass, in the creek, everywhere. At first we'd figured it was a pack of coyotes. We'd seen it sometimes. They can't scavenge and start hunting deer or cattle. The worst was when they breed with feral dogs. But this wasn't like that. See, when a pack of dogs or wolves or coyotes attack something, they do it right. They'll pick off the one that's weak or sick or old or just small. They'll hunt it, draw it into a corner, someplace it can't get out of, and they'll run it right to the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see that alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. It'll just notice that its throat is gone, and then it'll drop dead. It's quick, it's clean. That wasn't what happened here. Something had run up on a den of deer. Coyotes won't attack a den. Wolves neither, because they'd get too much of a fight. There were 3, I think. 3 bodies, just torn apart. You'd see a head here, a leg there, a torso there. Predators don't do that. They don't leave behind scraps. What had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. but we didn't know that. We saw a bunch of carcasses and we think it's something we gotta take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home. He thought it was a pack of feral dogs, but I wasn't leaving him, and I damn sure wasn't walking through 2 miles of woods alone, with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. He was only a 13 at the time, so a .22 rifle was about the only gun he could reliably use. Dad had the shotgun, and I wasn't going anywhere without it. It took me a while to convince him, but we finally began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't hard either. We just followed the blood. Either that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. I don't know. I know that I'd never seen my dad scared before that night. We started hearing noises. I've been in a lot of woods in my life. I've been all over the world, and I ain't never heard a noise like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. Heard deer and fox and rabbits and raccoons and birds just scared. Keep in mind, this was maybe 12 or 1 o'clock. Except the fox and some birds. Nothing was supposed to be even awake. But they weren't just awake. They were moving. I saw flocks of birds that night fly straight into trees, just trying to get out of there. We came up on a pack of coyotes. Nearly shot a couple, thinking it was what we were looking for. But then we saw they were running towards us. They ran right past us, didn't even notice. Then some deer did the same. Then some rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even a couple wild hogs. These things were supposed to be eating each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting out of there. We should have put it together, that maybe whatever we were tracking, and it wasn't something we could kill. I don't know why we didn't go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature, to go toward trouble, to fight. And knowing what I knew about what my father did during the war, my nature was to stay close to him. We finally get into an open alley. It was normally a soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. We saw the track then. A lot of animals fleeing the forest had paved over the land. But where the deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step. Like they were leaving it for us to find. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was, couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. But that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighing 40 pounds wet nearly tore out my damn throat once. All that meant is that it's quick and hard to kill. So we followed the tracks, and it didn't take us long to find where it is. There's this old schoolhouse that sits on top of a hill. Half of it had been ripped out by a tornado, but nobody lived there, not for a long time. We caught homeless people in there sometimes, or druggies looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was just some sick kid riding a high. But we didn't think that for long. We get within 50 yards, and we hear this noise. A kind of screeching sound. It was sort of made up of 2 different sounds. One was a high-pitched screech, another was a low-pitched growl. It was making both, the same time. We get within 20 yards, and we hear the sound. I can remember thinking that it sounded much like paper being torn apart, while someone was swinging water in a bucket back and forth. Dad looks at me, kneels down and whispers, "I gotta stay behind him, 'cause we're about to corner him." Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially when it's a predator. But we can tell by the tracks that it's just one. He tells me it's probably a single, feral dog, probably rabid. The plan is to sneak up on it while it's eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting it till it don't move anymore. Then slit its throat. And if it gets to Dad, it's my job to shoot it, or stab it, to get it off of him. So he walks up, and I'm right behind him, just a tad to his side, so I can see what it is. I wish to this day I hadn't. It was leaning over a carcass, tears off its flesh, and throws what it doesn't nibble at the side. There's blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It's pale white, human looking, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like a human, but it sat like a monkey, hunched over. And its hands weren't normal. It had long fingers with claws at the end. So we see that, and my dad hesitates. He wasn't about to fire on a person, so he clears his throat to try get it to turn around. I swear to God, all the noise just ceased. I ain't never heard true silence before that, and not after. But for 2 seconds, nothing. Nothing made any noise, which made it all the louder when it turned around, made this shrill cry, and jumped on Dad. He got a shot off. I think he missed. If he hit the thing, it didn't mind, but it was on him. It tears parts of him off. I start shooting with the 22 point blank, but it barely bled the thing. I got 5 rounds, and then I started hitting it with the gun butt, but it wasn't budging. It didn't even register that I was there. It's clawing at my dad, taking off bits of his flesh. It starts on his torso, ripping off the skin, his tip, and then it moves up. It tore off his throat, it tore off his nose, his eyes. It scalped him. Then it started digging, ripped off the bottom half of his jaw with a little bone, and then that tube in your neck, then his ribs. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ended up in this thing's shoulder, and my dad ends up on my back. I'm running, and by God, I'm running faster than I've ever ran before or after, and it's following me. I end up back in the woods, opposite the ones we've been in. I'm heading towards my landlord's house, because it's half a mile away. I can hear this thing screeching and moaning. I hear these 3 branches crack and get thrown down. It sounds like someone's taking an axe to every single tree I pass. It's cracking so loud and so often, but I just ain't looking back. Finally, I trip into gravel and look up, and there's my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire. I scream and cry, and they come over. I'm telling them to call an ambulance, and he looks at me, and I'll never forget what he said. "What's that on your back?" he asked me. Just as he said that, he saw One of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere. It was what was left of my dad. Most of his head, his torso, but nothing after the waist. Suddenly we hear it, screeching. He grabs me. My dad gets thrown on the ground. I'm fighting him, crying because I think we can still save him somehow, but my dad was gone before I ever picked him up. He has to pick me up and throw me inside before I come with him. He and his buddies were all inside and locking doors and getting their guns. The landlord's asking me what happened, but I don't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it together to understand that there was something dangerous there. All the lights in the house are on, and someone calls the cops. They'll be there in about 15 minutes. We look outside and see it walk in front of the fire they'd made. Don't know what it is. One of them says it looks like an ape. Suddenly something goes through the window. We shoot at it, but ain't the thing. It's my landlord's dog. Just the body though, not his head or legs. We start pushing things in front of the door and windows when we hear something in the garage. I remember one of his friends saying that the doors were open. We hear the metal and glass just get ripped apart. We put a couch and a TV in front of the door to the garage. It banged around some more, but then it got quiet. Not silent like before. We could hear it move around some, and the guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone hands me a pistol. No sooner did it cock the hammer back did we hear something shatter upstairs. Then we heard it screech again, except now it was louder, and it didn't echo and fade out, because it was inside. We all rushed to the one door leading upstairs, and we got to it just as the thing did. It opened it a bit, and 4 or 5 men just slammed into it. He got his hand through though. Someone with a shotgun took care of that though. Put the barrel right up to its wrist and pulled the trigger. Cut its hand off clean. That only annoyed it though. It started pushing on that door, clawing. We were on one side pushing it as best we could, and it was on the other side doing the same. That wood just wasn't going to hold. So someone tells us to keep our heads down. Suddenly the top half of the door is just gone. My ears are ringing and there are splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them just unloaded on the top of that door. I don't really know where it went after that. The police got there. I was glued to that door. What was left of it. The sun was up before they got me off it. They put me in a hospital for a while. A lot of people talked to me, but I didn't talk back. Not for a long, long time. When I got back home, I got a job for the landlord, working on the farm. We didn't talk much, not about the thing. But I signed up for the army when I was 19, and he sat me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I asked him, right away, what the police told him. The story they went with was a wild animal, probably a wolf or maybe a bear that had migrated north. I asked him how they could say that when they had the hand. He looked at me, stunned. He tells me that hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it in his car wrecked, drove off into a tree and died on impact. The hand was never found, probably taken away by an animal. The cops, when they would acknowledge the hand existed at all, said it was simply the paw of the bear that looked like a human hand. I never talked to the landlord again. He went missing when I was in basic. Never found him. They said he owed some people some money and just ran away. But I don't think it's that simple. I never went back to those woods. I wouldn't, even if I had the whole damn army at my back. But that was a lie. When my mother died, I don't think my father felt he had anything left, and that he might as well settle old scores. He went to those woods. He never came back. FBI called. They did a show for everyone involved, but I knew they weren't really looking. I had to get one drunk and slip him a few 50s before he finally told me that they get a few calls about those woods every year, about someone up and vanishing. But that was all he wanted to tell me. Before he got up and left with the rest of his team, he wrote "The Rake" onto a napkin. I didn't know what that meant until I searched for it on the internet. And honestly, I would rather not have known.
The Wendigo, a creature from the mythology of Native Americans that lived in the region of the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. It's born from pure cannibalism, and its hunger is never satisfied. There are a lot of stories surrounding the mysterious 13-mile woods of the northern New Hampshire. I've heard the stories of hunting parties starving out there and resorting to cannibalism. There's no telling what happens out there. This story was told to me by my grandfather, who met one of the people involved. The year was 1957. His name was Arnold Watson. He loved to hunt, and he loved even more to take long hunting trips in the woods. Of course, he never went alone. He had a couple old friends he'd take along, Andy Johnson and Darren Trimble. He hadn't seen them in years, so they all decided to go on a week-long hunting trip. They packed up all their stuff: hunting rifles, blankets, tents, matches, a week's worth of ammunition and food. The three of them piled into Arnold's Chevy pickup truck. The ride through the winding dirt roads was long and bumpy. They were deep into the woods now. Then, the engine started making clicks and spluttering noises, like it was breaking down. It slowed to a stop. "Start, goddammit," said Arnold as he banged on the wheel. Asked Andy. "I must have forgotten," Arnold said as he sighed and sat back in his seat. "We might as well make camp near here. I don't want to get too far from the truck." So, they ventured into the woods a bit and found a small clearing near a river where they could set up their tents. It was already getting dark, so they started a fire and had a little something to eat, and went to bed. They slept with their guns at their bedside, just in case. They all slept soundly through the night. Arnold was the first awake. He stood up and stretched, letting out a long yawn. He stepped outside of the tent and rubbed his eyes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. A bear had come and tossed everything about and eaten almost all of their food. Arnold ran into his tent, grabbed his rifle, and aimed at the bear. His running around had already startled the bear, and it had gotten away before Arnold could get a clear shot. "Andy, Daryl, get up! Damn bear's gotten all our food." Andy and Daryl scrambled up. "What in the hell are you—" Daryl stared, open-mouthed, at the remaining scraps of their food. Most of the shotgun shells had been thrown into the river, and only a few usable shells remained. "Holy crap, what are we gonna do now? We ain't got nothing. No food, no ammo, no—" He was cut off by Andy. "Just keep calm, Daryl. I think there's more ammo in the truck." He trailed off. "Do you guys remember the way back to the truck?" Arnold asked, nervously. "I think it's this way. Or no, this way? Well, it might have been this way," said Andy. Daryl smacked his hand on his face. "You ain't got a damn idea what you're talking about." Daryl and Andy both lunged at each other and started wrestling, cursing in between breaths. Hey, stop that!" Arrow pulled Daryl off of Andy. "We gotta get along. We're in a survival situation now. Ain't no fun and games. We could easily die out here, and no one would ever find us. Our best bet would be to follow the river. Maybe you could find a town or a trading post or something." Daryl snapped. "A town? Out here? My ass. We're all alone out there. We'll never find our way out." Andy's always been the weak one. Not very surprising that he'd be the first one to break. They wandered along the banks of the river for a bit, cold and hungry. Night came, but they didn't stop. Sounds started to come from the woods next to the river, like twigs snapping and leaves crunching. Andy perked right up. "What the hell was that?" Andy whispered, nervously. "Probably just a rabbit, you wuss," Daryl snapped. "Don't be so worrisome." A couple minutes passed, and Andy sat down to rest. "I'll just be a minute. Go on without me," he panted. "You sure?" Arnold asked. "Yeah, I won't be long," Andy assured. So they continued. A blood-curdling scream filled the air several seconds later. "Daryl! Ah! Help me!" The scream cut off quickly to gurgling and sounds of something eating. Arnold and Daryl ran back along the stream, screaming Andy's name. They heard a snarl and saw the silhouette of a tall, thin, snouted figure with something dripping from its mouth. It growled at them loudly and trotted off into the woods. "What in the Lord's name was that?" asked Daryl. "How am I supposed to know? Strike a match so we can find Andy." Daryl struck the match and looked in horror. Andy's mangled remains lay on the ground. His face was half devoured, with his skull showing. Blood and flesh covered his face. A whole section was torn out of his chest. His ribs were picked clean. His entrails were out and laying all over him, partly eaten. His thighs were ravaged. There were parts where his bone was showing in his leg. Worst of all, a horrifying expression was displayed on his face, like he was frozen in time as soon as he saw the creature. "Oh my God." Daryl started mumbling gibberish, curled into a ball, and rocked slowly. "Why him? Why?" he stuttered. Arnold tried to comfort him, but he was hysterical. "We gotta keep moving, buddy. We both loved him, but it's done now, and we gotta move on." Daryl cut him off. "How could you say that? You act like you don't even care about him. I loved him like a brother. You don't even care. You don't even care, you selfish asshole." Daryl lunged at Arnold's throat. He gripped it tightly against the ground, Arnold struggled to get out of his grip. He kneed him in the stomach, and Daryl fell to the ground. Arnold started pounding him in the face. Daryl was helpless. Arnold picked him up and threw his head against the tree. Daryl slumped to the ground, leaving a thick streak of crimson blood going down the tree. His eyes turned black, and he was crazed with bloodlust. Arnold started chewing on Daryl's left arm, but then he snapped out of it. What have I done? He looked at his blood-covered hands. He stayed there with the bodies, not sleeping, just sitting, with a blank expression, thinking of what he'd done. Eventually, Arnold realized it was his duty to get back to a town and tell people what had happened. He got up and started walking. He walked for hours. Then the twig snapping came back and the leaves crunching. He felt a warm breath on the back of his neck. He turned around slowly, and towering over him was the beast. Glowing yellow eyes, antlers, and a body that seemed half-rotted. The ribcage was exposed, with rotted flesh in and around it. Blood and flesh dripped from his mouth, his face covered in raw muscle and deep cuts. In areas that weren't rotted, like his back and shoulders, were carpeted in short, patchy, light brown fur. One of its arms was completely rotted to the bone. Arnold screamed and ran, but it leapt and tackled him. It growled in his face and bit a chunk from his leg. Arnold screamed in agony, trying to escape from under it, and squirmed and kicked until he got free, and tried to start punching it. This only angered it more. It lunged at him again, but this time Arnold moved out of the way and the beast tumbled into the river. Arnold saw this as his chance. He tried his best to limp over to the river where it was recovering from the fall. Despite the excruciating pain, he tackled the beast and pushed all his weight onto its head, trying to drown it. It snarled under the water and flailed its arms and legs, but Arnold kept his grip. It slowly became weaker and weaker until it silenced completely. Arnold sighed in relief and fell on his back onto the bank of the river. He rested for a while and tried to move on. He limped through the woods until morning and found a road. Thank God, he thought. It's almost over. Arnold was on the road for only a short time before a truck came along. It pulled over and the man scrambled out of the driver's seat and helped Arnold. Jesus, man, what happened? Arnold replied tiredly. I'll explain soon. Water. A ride, please. The man looked befuddled. Of course. Let me help you into the car. Arnold climbed in and took a big, long swig of the water from the man's bottle. He told the entire story to the man, the same one I just told you. That man was my grandfather. Arnold was taken to a hospital, but died due to an infection in the wound on his leg. Every once in a while, hunters will come back with stories of hearing loud, blood-curdling screams, or similar stories of cannibalistic beasts. Whether they're true or not, there's something lurking in the 13-mile woods. If you ever decide to take a trip there and you find an old 50s truck or an abandoned campsite, turn back. For God's sake, turn back. And if you don't, God help you.